In the unforgiving mountains of the Colorado Territory, beneath the shadow of snow-capped peaks that seemed to pierce the very heavens themselves, a tale of calculated horror unfolded during the winter of 1874 that would remain buried in territorial archives for nearly 8 decades. This is the documented account of what became known as the Silver Creek Massacre, a series of events surrounding the Blackwood sisters and their boarding house that promised weary travelers more than just warm beds and hot meals. The year was 1874. The Colorado Territory had been established for just 13 years, and the promise of silver, gold, and precious metals drew desperate men from across the country to this harsh, unforgiving wilderness. Approximately 23 miles southwest of Denver, along what is now known as the Old Mountain Trail, stood a small mining settlement called Silver Creek. It was little more than a collection of wooden structures, a general store, a blacksmith shop, and a prominent 3-story building that served as both boarding house and restaurant, Blackwood's Mountain Retreat. The Colorado Territory of the 1870s was still very much a frontier in every sense of the word. President Andrew Johnson had signed the Colorado Organic Act in 1861, but formal governance remained minimal at best. The Indian Wars were ongoing, with various tribes actively resisting the encroachment on their ancestral lands. The Denver and Rio Grande Railroad had only just begun construction, making travel treacherous and communication sporadic. Denver, established as the territorial capital, was struggling to maintain order over the vast wilderness under its jurisdiction. This was Colorado before it became fixed in the American imagination as a land of opportunity and natural beauty. It was raw, dangerous, and largely lawless. The federal government maintained only a token presence, primarily through military outposts scattered throughout the territory and Indian agencies that were often hundreds of miles apart. Law enforcement consisted of a territorial marshal with a handful of deputies responsible for an area roughly the size of modern-day Pennsylvania. Local governance fell to appointed officials whose authority often extended only as far as their personal influence or the threat of their weapons. Justice was frequently administered by vigilante committees, and disputes were settled more often with guns than with law books. It was against this backdrop of limited oversight and abundant opportunity that the Blackwood sisters established themselves and their deadly enterprise. According to territorial records and newspaper accounts from the Rocky Mountain News, the establishment was owned and operated by Sisters Victoria and Celeste Blackwood, who had arrived from Pennsylvania in early 1873. The women, aged 29 and 26 respectively, were unusual figures in a landscape dominated by rugged men seeking fortune in the unforgiving mountains. Their arrival was noted briefly in the territorial newspaper. 2 sisters of refined bearing have established themselves in the hospitality business at Silver Creek, offering clean accommodations and civilized dining to the weary traveler. Their establishment promises to bring a touch of Eastern refinement to our developing territory. What the newspaper failed to mention was that the sisters had appeared seemingly overnight with resources that seemed disproportionate to their modest backgrounds. County deed records show they purchased the property with cash, a substantial sum that raised eyebrows among local businessmen. More unusual still was that no one questioned their presence or means, at least not publicly. The territorial census of 1870 lists no Blackwoods in Colorado, and inquiries to Pennsylvania authorities years later revealed no record of sisters matching their descriptions from the counties they claimed as their origin. It was as if they had materialized from the mountain mist itself, carrying with them a dark purpose that would not become apparent until it was too late for many unfortunate souls. The settlement of Silver Creek itself had a troubled history even before the sisters' arrival. Founded in 1867 as a mining outpost after significant silver deposits were discovered in the nearby mountains, it had briefly flourished before a series of violent incidents earned it a reputation as cursed ground among the more superstitious miners. In 1871, 5 prospectors were found dead in their mine shaft, allegedly the result of a cave-in, though some whispered of foul play related to claim jumping. A letter from Indian agent Thomas Crawford to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs in Washington, dated August 1872, mentions Silver Creek as a settlement of questionable character, frequented by men seeking to avoid scrutiny from both military and civilian authorities. He notes that the settlement's location in a narrow valley with multiple escape routes into the surrounding mountains made it ideally situated for those with reasons to depart hastily. By the time the Blackwood sisters arrived, Silver Creek was in decline, with many miners having moved on to more promising claims elsewhere. The previous year, the settlement's first saloon owner was discovered frozen to death in a snowbank, officially ruled accidental, though rumors persisted of gambling debts and territorial disputes. The territorial government, however, maintained a small office there due to its strategic location on the route between Denver and the southern mining districts, making it a natural stopping point for travelers, freight wagons, and official correspondence. This positioning would prove crucial to the sisters' operation. Blackwood's mountain retreat stood at the settlement's eastern edge, the last building before the trail wound higher into increasingly desolate country. For travelers heading into the wilderness, it represented a final opportunity for comfort and civilization. For those returning from the harsh mountain claims, it offered welcome relief after days or weeks in conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. The building itself had an unusual history. Originally constructed in 1868 by a Norwegian immigrant named Erik Nordahl as a combination trading post and family home, it had changed hands twice before the Blackwoods acquired it. Nordahl had incorporated architectural elements unusual for frontier construction: thick log walls reinforced with local stone, a basement dug deep into the mountainside for food storage, and a third story with windows that provided commanding views of the approaching trails. Local legend, recorded by folklorist Mary Henderson in 1925, held that Nordahl had built hidden compartments into the walls to hide valuables and supplies from Indian raids, a common practice among frontier settlers who lived in constant fear of attack. Whether this was true or merely convenient folklore that later helped explain the Blackwoods' modifications remains uncertain. What is documented is that Nordahl died under unclear circumstances in late 1871. The county coroner's report simply states death by exposure, though a note in the margin mentions unusual circumstances suggesting the body had been moved after death. His property passed briefly to a mining investor who never occupied it, then to a retired cavalry officer named Jameson, who operated it for 8 months before selling to the Blackwoods. The sisters immediately set about transforming the property. They hired local laborers to make extensive renovations, paying generously for swift work and absolute discretion. Samuel Mitchell, one of the carpenters employed, later recalled to investigators, they had real specific ideas about what they wanted built. Strange requests like reinforced floors in certain rooms and what looked like storage areas that didn't make much sense for a boarding house. I figured maybe they were worried about Indian raids and wanted hiding places. They paid in gold coin, no questions asked, so neither did we. The renovations took approximately 8 weeks, during which the sisters stayed at a hotel in Denver. They made frequent trips to oversee the work, always arriving together and leaving together. The laborers noted that Celeste, the younger sister, carried architectural drawings and made detailed measurements, while Victoria handled all financial transactions with an efficiency that suggested extensive business experience. Mitchell also recalled another peculiar detail. They insisted on installing what they called guest privacy features, extra thick walls between certain rooms, and soundproofing that seemed excessive for a simple boarding house. When I asked about it, the older sister Victoria said they catered to businessmen who needed to conduct confidential meetings. Seemed reasonable enough at the time. By April 1873, Blackwood's mountain retreat was open for business. The transformation was remarkable. The rough trading post had become an establishment that would not have been out of place in Denver, or even back east. Polished wooden floors, actual glass windows, a luxury in the territory, and furnishings that must have been transported at considerable expense from Denver or possibly as far as Chicago. According to the Rocky Mountain News, the opening attracted visitors from as far as 15 miles away, curious to see the establishment that promises to bring Eastern hospitality to our rugged frontier. The article described Victoria Blackwood as a woman of striking presence and obvious education who oversees the establishment with grace and efficiency, while Celeste was noted as more reserved in manner yet meticulous in her attention to guest comfort and dietary requirements. The sisters quickly established a reputation for running a superior establishment, unusual in a frontier environment where most boarding houses were rough affairs offering basic beds, simple meals, and little in the way of amenities. Blackwood's mountain retreat, by contrast, served quality meals at regular hours, maintained strict standards of cleanliness, and offered what they advertised as premium accommodations for the discerning traveler. Fighting, excessive drinking, and disorderly conduct were not tolerated, with offenders permanently barred from returning. This atmosphere of relative refinement attracted a different clientele than the typical frontier boarding house. While local miners and cowboys occasionally stayed there when funds permitted, it primarily drew travelers of means, merchants, investors, attorneys, mining engineers, and territorial officials whose business brought them through the mountains. It was precisely this clientele that would prove most valuable and most vulnerable to the Blackwood's true enterprise. The first 9 months of operation passed without incident. The sisters became known figures in the small community, though they maintained a certain distance that some attributed to their Eastern upbringing. They attended church services when weather permitted, contributed appropriately to community causes, and Victoria occasionally played piano at social gatherings, displaying an education that impressed the rough frontier community. They contributed to worthy causes that enhanced their reputation: a donation to the schoolhouse fund, money for a new church bell, support for a volunteer fire brigade. Victoria, the more socially adept of the pair, cultivated relationships with territorial officials and businessmen who passed through, engaging them in conversation about Eastern politics and culture, and ensuring they received preferential treatment at the mountain retreat. Celeste, by contrast, remained largely in the background, efficient but reserved, speaking little but observing much. Guests often commented on her ability to anticipate their needs, appearing with extra blankets before they realized they were cold, serving meals perfectly timed to their schedules, and maintaining their rooms with an attention to detail that bordered on the uncanny. The first documented irregularity associated with the Blackwood sisters appears in a complaint filed with the Territorial Marshal's office in February 1874. A telegram from Mrs. Adelaide Morrison of Chicago inquired about her husband, Robert Morrison, a mining equipment manufacturer who had traveled to Colorado and whose last correspondence mentioned taking accommodations at a superior establishment operated by refined ladies near the mountain mining district. The Marshal's cursory investigation concluded that Mr. Morrison had likely continued his journey to California, or perhaps returned east by a different route. His luggage, however, was found in storage at Blackwood's mountain retreat, allegedly left behind with instructions to forward it to Pueblo. Instructions the sisters produced on a note that Mrs. Morrison later claimed bore no resemblance to her husband's distinctive handwriting. What the official report neglected to mention, but was recorded in Deputy Marshal William Cartwright's private journal, discovered decades later, was that Morrison had been carrying nearly $8,000 in bank drafts and gold coin, a substantial fortune in 1874. The deputy noted, "Inquired at First National Bank in Denver. No drafts in Morrison name have been presented for payment. Sisters claim he spoke of business associates in California who would handle his financial affairs. Something about their demeanor troubles me. Too rehearsed, perhaps, like actors who have practiced their lines too often." Robert Morrison's background, pieced together from Chicago business records and his wife's subsequent correspondence with authorities, reveals he was a 44-year-old entrepreneur who had built a successful business manufacturing mining equipment during the Western expansion. His journey to Colorado was for the purpose of evaluating potential partnerships with mining operations and establishing distribution points for his equipment. According to his last letter to his wife, dated January 18, 1874, he had completed his initial meetings in Denver and found them most promising. He mentioned staying at an establishment of surprising refinement operated by two sisters from Pennsylvania, and his intention to visit several mining operations in the mountains before finalizing agreements and returning home. He mentioned specific details that would later prove significant. "The accommodations here surpass anything I expected to find in the territory. The proprietresses, Victoria and Celeste Blackwood, have created an oasis of civilization in this wilderness. Victoria in particular has demonstrated a remarkable knowledge of Eastern business practices and has offered to introduce me to several local investors of her acquaintance." He was never seen again. This was the first thread in what would become a tapestry of disappearances associated with the Blackwood establishment. Between February 1874 and October 1875, territorial records indicate that at least 12 men of substantial means who passed through Silver Creek were never documented as having reached their next destination. In each case, the last confirmed sighting was at Blackwood's mountain retreat. What makes this case particularly disturbing is not just the disappearances themselves, but the calculated efficiency with which the sisters operated and the community's complicit silence. As one former resident interviewed in 1948 by University of Colorado researchers recalled, "My father said people knew something wasn't right about those women, the way they seemed to know everything about their guests before the guests knew it themselves, always asking questions, always taking notes, but nobody said nothing. In those days, you minded your own business if you wanted to keep breathing, especially if those ladies had been kind to you." Another account from James Whitfield, whose grandfather had been the settlement's blacksmith, revealed more troubling details. Grandfather noticed that whenever certain types of guests stayed at the retreat, always men traveling alone, always men who seemed to have money, Victoria Blackwood would visit his shop the following day with unusual requests. Once it was for a special type of shovel, claimed it was for their garden. Another time she needed rope, lots of it, and asked specifically for the strongest kind he had. When he joked that she must be planning to tie down the whole mountain, she didn't laugh, just stared at him with those cold eyes and said, "One never knows what purposes strong rope might serve, Mr. Whitfield." The operation of the sisters' establishment followed a distinct pattern. According to assembled accounts, Blackwood's mountain retreat offered 3 types of accommodations: basic rooms with shared facilities for working men, standard private rooms for travelers of modest means, and premium suites for guests of distinction. These premium suites were always located on the 3rd floor, where the building backed against the mountainside, a curious architectural feature that would later prove significant. The building's layout, modified extensively by the sisters, created what investigators would later describe as a perfect infrastructure for concealment and disposal. The basement, originally intended for food storage, had been expanded into a series of connected chambers that extended back into the mountain itself. County records show the sisters filed permits for structural improvements to prevent settling and ensure guest safety, though the actual modifications went far beyond what was described in the official documents. Victoria, the elder sister, typically managed the public areas, greeting guests and engaging them in conversation. She was described in multiple accounts as elegant rather than merely attractive, with dark hair always perfectly arranged and eyes that seemed to catalog rather than simply observe. She possessed an extraordinary memory for details and an ability to extract information from guests without seeming intrusive. A letter from Marcus Thornton, a Philadelphia industrialist who would later become one of the sisters' victims, to his business partner in March 1874, provides insight into Victoria's methods. The proprietress here is a most remarkable woman. Within 2 hours of my arrival, she had ascertained the nature of my business in Colorado, the extent of my holdings in Pennsylvania, the names of my bankers, and even the schools attended by my children, all through what seemed like the most natural conversation imaginable. I found myself speaking more freely than is my custom with strangers, particularly regarding financial matters and travel plans. There is something in her manner that inspires confidence, though upon reflection I wonder at my own unusual candor. Celeste, described in accounts as the shadow sister, with an unsettling ability to appear without warning, managed the guest rooms and dining services. Where Victoria was charming and engaging, Celeste was watchful, efficient, and unnervingly quiet. The contrast in their personalities created a complementary dynamic that served their operation perfectly. Victoria identified and charmed potential victims, while Celeste managed the practical aspects of their elimination. A diary entry from Martha Sinclair, one of the few female guests who stayed at Blackwood's mountain retreat while traveling to join her husband in the mining camps, provides one of the rare insights into Celeste's character. The younger Miss Blackwood moves through the house like a specter, appearing suddenly where she was not moments before. 3 times today I turned to find her standing silently behind me, watching. When I remarked upon her quiet step, she smiled in a way that never reached her eyes and said simply, "In our profession, Miss Sinclair, discretion is essential. Our guests value their privacy above all else." Something in her tone made me profoundly uneasy, enough so that I've decided to continue my journey earlier than planned. The sisters maintained an atmosphere of sophisticated hospitality that was genuinely rare in frontier establishments. Guests frequently commented on the quality of the meals, the cleanliness of the accommodations, and the unusual attention to detail that characterized every aspect of their stay. This reputation attracted precisely the clientele the sisters sought: successful men traveling alone through dangerous territory, often carrying substantial sums of money or valuable documents. Dr. Henry Aldrich, a mining engineer who stayed at the mountain retreat in September 1874 and survived to provide one of the few detailed first-hand accounts, wrote in his journal, "The elder Miss Blackwood possesses a memory that borders on the supernatural. Upon learning I was bound for the Caribou mine, she recalled precise details about 4 other gentlemen who had traveled that route in recent months. Their names, their business, even the contents of their luggage. When I expressed amazement at this ability, her expression changed momentarily to something I cannot quite describe before she laughed it away, saying, 'A good hostess never forgets her guests, Dr. Aldrich, particularly those she hopes will speak well of her establishment to others.'" Aldrich's journal, published in part in the Colorado Historical Quarterly in 1951, continues with observations that would prove prophetic. Miss Celeste maintains the establishment with an attention to detail that is both impressive and somewhat unnerving. The linens are always fresh, the floors spotless despite the muddy boots of frontier travelers, and the meals would rival those of the finest hotels in Denver. Yet there is something in her manner that causes one to avoid meeting her gaze directly. She moves through the rooms like a shadow, appearing suddenly where she had not been moments before. I confess to feeling observed, though perhaps this is merely the natural wariness of a man traveling alone in dangerous territory. Aldrich survived his stay, perhaps because he mentioned colleagues who would be following the same route within days. Others were not so fortunate. The case of Benjamin Wheeler provides a particularly well-documented example of the Blackwood Sisters methodology. Wheeler, a 41-year-old investment banker from Boston, arrived at the mountain retreat on March 8, 1874. His purpose in Colorado was to evaluate mining operations that had sought financing from his institution for expansion and equipment purchases. According to the stage company's records, he was carrying a leather briefcase containing substantial bank drafts, letters of credit, and detailed financial reports. Victoria Blackwood personally welcomed him and, according to the desk clerk's later testimony, spent considerable time over dinner discussing his itinerary and business interests. The conversation, as recalled by other guests present that evening, revealed that Wheeler was traveling alone, had no set schedule, and was carrying authorization to invest up to $50,000 in promising ventures, an enormous sum in 1874. Celeste was observed taking special care with his luggage, personally carrying it to one of the premium third-floor suites despite the usual practice of having hired help perform such tasks. She also brought him additional amenities throughout the evening: extra coal for his fireplace, fresh water for washing, and what she described as a special mountain tea to help with the altitude adjustment. The following morning, Wheeler was not present for breakfast. When inquiries were made by other guests, Victoria explained that he had departed before dawn, having received urgent word about a mining accident requiring immediate investor attention. She produced a note allegedly written by Wheeler, expressing his regrets for the sudden departure and his satisfaction with the accommodations. 2 weeks later, when Wheeler failed to return to Boston as scheduled, his bank sent telegrams to various territorial officials and business contacts. The investigation that followed was cursory at best. The note was accepted as genuine, and Wheeler's disappearance was attributed to the common practice of Eastern businessmen becoming so enamored with Western opportunities that they extended their stays indefinitely. What authorities didn't know was that Celeste Blackwood had spent considerable time studying handwriting and document forgery. Among her personal effects discovered after their eventual flight was a journal containing practice signatures of at least 15 different men, including Wheeler's. The precision of these forgeries was so remarkable that when they were later examined by a handwriting expert from the Pinkerton Detective Agency in 1954, he noted they would have passed scrutiny at any financial institution of the period. The discovery of Wheeler's true fate came through an unexpected source. In April 1874, seasonal snowmelt caused significant flooding along Silver Creek, undermining the foundation of the old assay office. During repair work, laborers discovered what initially appeared to be mining equipment buried beneath the building's rear foundation. Closer inspection revealed human remains wrapped in canvas and weighed down with mining tools. According to the Territorial Marshal's report dated April 23, 1874, an investigation uncovered the partial remains of what appeared to be 3 adult males. The report notes, bodies appear to have been interred for approximately 3 to 8 months. Identification difficult due to condition and absence of distinguishing personal effects. Cause of death, undetermined due to deterioration. What the official report omitted was that all 3 sets of remains showed evidence of having been restrained with the same type of rope used throughout the mountain retreat for various household purposes. This detail appears only in the private notes of Deputy Marshal William Cartwright, found among his effects after his death in 1919, and subsequently archived in the Colorado Historical Society collection. Cartwright's notes, written in a personal shorthand that wasn't decoded until 1961, reveal his growing suspicion. Found same rope as used at Blackwood establishment. Mentioned this observation to Marshal Peterson, who advised discretion pending further investigation. Later learned Peterson had received substantial financial assistance from V. Blackwood for his daughter's medical expenses last winter. Have preserved samples and measurements privately. Something deeply wrong at Silver Creek. Cartwright's position was precarious. As a deputy with limited authority, challenging his superior or making accusations against respected business owners, particularly women of apparent refinement, could end his career or worse. Nevertheless, he continued to collect evidence quietly, maintaining what amounted to an unauthorized parallel investigation. His notes detailed disturbing patterns in the Blackwood sisters' behavior. V. always engages male travelers of substantial means in extensive conversation, showing particular interest in those traveling alone with flexible schedules. C. always handles premium guest accommodations personally, refusing assistance from hired staff. After certain guests depart, sisters often make purchases at local businesses that seem inconsistent with normal boarding house operations. The discovery prompted minimal official action. The remains were reinterred in unmarked graves at the Silver Creek Cemetery, and the incident was attributed to typical frontier violence, possibly claimed jumping disputes or robberies gone wrong. No connection was publicly made to the Blackwood sisters or their establishment. In fact, the sisters' standing in the community seemed to improve during this period. A notice in the Rocky Mountain News for May 1874 mentioned their donation to the Territorial Capital's Library Fund, and Victoria Blackwood was appointed to the newly formed Committee for Territorial Tourism Development. The Territorial Governor's correspondence from June 1874 includes a letter commending the Blackwoods for bringing Eastern standards of hospitality to our developing territory and suggesting their establishment as a model for proper commercial development that enhances rather than diminishes our reputation. The letter specifically mentions their discretion regarding matters that might otherwise discourage investment in our promising region, a curious phrase that takes on sinister significance in light of later discoveries. This veneer of respectability was carefully cultivated and strategically maintained. As later investigations revealed, the sisters kept detailed records documenting the activities and backgrounds of every guest, with particular attention to those traveling alone, those carrying significant funds, and those whose disappearance might go unnoticed for extended periods. These records, discovered decades later during renovation of the Territorial Governor's Mansion, contained coded entries that researchers from the University of Colorado partially deciphered in 1958. The code used simple letter substitutions and referred to potential victims as investments, with annotations about their yield potential and risk factors. One entry dated August 12, 1874, when decoded, reads, "Boston investment arrived yesterday. Yield potential excellent. Carries authorization for $50,000 placement, plus personal funds estimated at $2,000, $3,000. Risk factors minimal. Traveling alone, no fixed schedule, limited territorial contacts. V. will handle documentation, while C. prepares the processing facility. Weather favorable for disposal." Another from October 15th of the same year reveals the calculated nature of their operation. Philadelphia merchant concluded successfully. Actual yield, $1,847 in currency, $623 in gold, plus property deeds requiring investigation. Personal effects disposed of as planned. C. concerned about recent territorial marshal inquiries, assured her our community relationships remain secure. A particularly chilling entry from December 1874 reads, "Processing of Denver attorney required exceptional measures. Subject regained consciousness during initial procedure. C. forced to employ alternative methods, resulting in significant cleanup requirements. Yield substantial, but complications necessitated 4-day closure for facility restoration. claimed water pipe burst to explain closure and lingering odors. The processing facility would later be identified as a concealed chamber built into the mountainside behind the mountain retreat, accessible only through a hidden panel in the wardrobe of the corner premium suite. The dimensions of this chamber, approximately 10 feet by 12 feet with a sloped dirt floor leading to a narrow drainage tunnel, suggested its grim purpose. Archaeological examination of the site in 1952 revealed traces of blood that had seeped deep into the clay floor, and evidence of lye having been used repeatedly to neutralize organic matter. Iron rings embedded in the wooden support beams indicated that restraints had been employed systematically. The drainage tunnel, roughly 40 feet in length, emerged in a dense grove of aspens along the creek, providing a concealed route for disposing of remains. The sisters' methodology appears to have been ruthlessly systematic. Based on reconstructed events from discovered documentation and physical evidence, they would identify victims who met specific criteria: traveling alone, carrying substantial funds, and unlikely to be immediately missed. These guests would be assigned to the corner premium suite with access to the hidden chamber. During the evening, likely after serving drugged refreshments, analysis of preserved bottles found on the property in 1952 showed residue consistent with chloral hydrate dissolved in brandy. The sisters would move the incapacitated victim into the concealed chamber. There they would eliminate the victim through methods that remain speculative due to lack of definitive forensic evidence, before systematically robbing them of valuables and important documents. A journal fragment attributed to Victoria, though handwriting analysis remains inconclusive, provides insight into their mindset. C believes we should limit our activities to maintain security. I disagree. The territorial authorities have proven their willingness to overlook inconsistencies when properly motivated. The community benefits from our presence and contributions. Why should we restrict our natural talents when opportunity presents itself so regularly? Another entry reveals the coldly practical nature of their partnership. C excels at the technical aspects while I handle the social requirements. She questions my practice of extended conversation with subjects before processing, but these discussions provide essential information for creating convincing documentation afterward. The Morrison matter demonstrated the value of thorough preparation. His wife's inquiries were successfully redirected based on details obtained during our final conversation. The disposal method was equally systematic. Bodies were apparently transported via the drainage tunnel to predetermined burial sites along the creek bank, locations that would be subject to seasonal flooding and natural erosion. The sophistication of this operation suggests the Blackwood sisters were not novices to criminal activity. Indeed, subsequent research by territorial historian Margaret Caldwell in 1963 uncovered evidence suggesting the Blackwoods may have operated previously under different names in Kansas and Wyoming, always in frontier settings where transient populations and minimal law enforcement created ideal conditions for predation. Newspaper accounts from Abilene, Kansas in 1871 mentioned the mysterious disappearance of two cattle buyers who had stayed at a boarding house run by two sisters of Eastern refinement who departed the area shortly after territorial marshals began making inquiries. A similar pattern emerged in Cheyenne, Wyoming, where records from 1872 describe the disappearance of three railroad investors who had been guests at an establishment operated by women matching the Blackwoods' general description. The pattern suggests a methodical strategy of migratory predation: establish a respectable business in a frontier community, operate until suspicions begin to develop, then relocate with accumulated wealth to establish new identities elsewhere. The Colorado Territory, with its sparse population, limited communication infrastructure, and general lawlessness, represented an ideal environment for such predators. What makes the case particularly disturbing is how the sisters maintained their operation despite mounting evidence. They employed a sophisticated combination of strategic bribery, community manipulation, and what can only be described as social blackmail. Evidence suggests they gathered compromising information about local officials and used it to ensure cooperation and silence. A cache of letters discovered in 1959 during renovation of the old territorial courthouse revealed that Victoria Blackwood had made substantial, charitable contributions to several key officials, always accompanied by notes mentioning our mutual interest in maintaining Silver Creek's reputation as a safe and welcoming destination for legitimate business travelers. The sisters also maintained what appears to have been a calculated system of financial leverage. Ledgers from several local businesses show that the Blackwoods extended unusually generous credit and business arrangements to influential citizens, effectively purchasing silence through financial obligation. The territorial newspaper editor, James Morrison, received what amounted to a business partnership offer from Victoria Blackwood in August 1874, shortly after publishing a brief editorial questioning the number of Eastern businessmen who seemed to vanish while traveling through the territory. No follow-up editorial ever appeared, and subsequent coverage of the mountain retreat was uniformly positive. More sinister was their apparent collection of compromising information about community leaders. Victoria's position as a hostess allowed her to observe indiscretions and gather confessions from men whose inhibitions were lowered by alcohol and isolation. Celeste's role managing accommodations gave her access to personal belongings and private correspondence. They maintained what investigators later described as an informal intelligence network that would have impressed professional spies. A small leather journal discovered among their abandoned possessions contained coded observations about various prominent citizens, including details that could only have been obtained through systematic surveillance or intimate knowledge of their private affairs. One partially decoded entry reads, "Territorial Judge M regularly visits the Chinese laundry for purposes unrelated to cleaning, pays premium for discretion. Mentioned during intoxication that his wife believes he works late on legal briefs every Wednesday. Potential leverage significant." Another notes, Marshal P now owes $890 to Denver gambling establishment. Second time debt settled by unknown benefactor. Pattern suggests vulnerability to financial pressure. Recommend monitoring for future opportunities. This combination of financial leverage, social standing, and blackmail potential created an invisible shield around the sisters that allowed them to operate with virtual immunity. When questions arose, they were quickly suppressed by those whose interests aligned with maintaining the status quo. The case of Robert Morrison, the Chicago manufacturer whose wife had initiated the first serious inquiry, exemplifies this dynamic. When territorial Marshal Peterson received Mrs. Morrison's persistent requests for investigation, his response was notably dismissive. Peterson, whose own financial obligations to the Blackwoods were documented in Victoria's private ledger, concluded that Morrison had simply decided to pursue business opportunities elsewhere without informing his wife, a conclusion that conveniently required no further investigation. Mrs. Morrison, however, was not easily discouraged. In September 1874, she made the arduous journey to Colorado herself, an extraordinary undertaking for a woman traveling alone. Her journal, preserved in the Chicago Historical Society collection, records her growing frustration with official indifference. "The authorities here seem determined to dismiss my concerns as female hysteria," she wrote. "When I presented specific inconsistencies in the account provided by the Blackwood women, Marshal Peterson became notably agitated and suggested I was perhaps overtired from my journey and imagining conspiracies where none existed. He advised me to return to Chicago and trust that Mr. Morrison would contact me when his business permitted. Eleanor Morrison's persistence might eventually have exposed the truth, but her presence created considerable alarm for the sisters." A coded entry dated September 28, 1874, indicates they were seriously considering processing Chicago widow despite elevated risk factors, suggesting they contemplated eliminating her as well. Only the unexpected arrival of her brother, who had followed her west out of concern for her safety, appears to have prevented this outcome. The presence of a second party with knowledge of her investigation and whereabouts made her an unacceptable risk according to their usual criteria. Mrs. Morrison's inquiries, while unsuccessful in the immediate term, did create a degree of scrutiny that made the sisters increasingly cautious. Their coded communications from this period show growing concern about elevated territorial attention and discussion of possibly relocating operations to a more suitable environment. One entry from early November 1874 reads, "V. confident current arrangements remain secure, but agrees prudent planning advisable. Southern territories offer promising opportunities with less developed oversight. Current inventory sufficient for comfortable transition if circumstances require." The Blackwood Sisters' operation might have continued indefinitely had it not been for an unexpected development in December 1874, a devastating avalanche that partially destroyed the mountain retreat and exposed secrets the sisters had worked carefully to conceal. The avalanche struck during the early morning hours of December 18, 1874. According to territorial weather records, an unusual warm spell had destabilized the snowpack on the mountain slopes above Silver Creek. The resulting slide carved a path directly through the settlement, destroying several buildings and severely damaging others. Blackwood's mountain retreat bore the brunt of the destruction. The avalanche's force sheared away the entire rear section of the third floor, exposing the interior structure like a dollhouse opened for inspection. What rescue workers discovered in the wreckage would transform a natural disaster into a criminal investigation that would shock the entire territory. Samuel Hendricks, a mining foreman who was among the first to reach the damaged building, later testified, "When we got up there to check for survivors, the whole back wall was gone. You could see right into the rooms. That's when we noticed something that didn't look right. There was a room that shouldn't have been there, built back into the mountain itself. And the smell coming from it, Lord help me, I'll never forget that smell." The concealed chamber, hidden behind what had appeared to be a solid wall, was fully exposed to view. The avalanche had not only revealed its existence, but had also scattered its contents across the mountainside. Among the debris, rescue workers found human remains, personal effects clearly belonging to multiple individuals, and a wooden chest containing documents that would provide devastating evidence of the sisters' crimes. Dr. Edwin Walsh, the territorial physician who was summoned to examine the discovery, recorded in his official report, "The concealed space appears to have been purpose-built for activities incompatible with legitimate boarding house operations. The presence of restraint mechanisms, drainage features, and chemical residues strongly suggests criminal activity of the most serious nature." Walsh's private notes, discovered years later among his personal papers, were more explicit, found evidence of at least 6 different individuals in various stages of decomposition. The systematic nature of the disposal suggests not random violence but calculated murder for profit. The engineering of the concealment demonstrates premeditation and extensive planning. These women are monsters masquerading as civilized human beings. The wooden chest, remarkably preserved despite the avalanche's force, contained the most damning evidence of all. Inside were detailed records of the sisters' operations spanning nearly 2 years, including victim profiles, financial tallies, and what can only be described as operational procedures for murder and disposal. The documents were written in the same cipher Deputy Marshal Cartwright had been attempting to decode for months. With this larger sample of material, territorial authorities brought in a linguistics expert from the University of Denver, who successfully broke the code within days. What emerged was a methodical record of systematic murder that read like a business ledger. Each entry contained the victim's name, physical description, estimated wealth, and detailed notes on their disposal. The clinical nature of the documentation was perhaps more chilling than the crimes themselves. One entry, dated July 3, 1874, and attributed to Victoria based on handwriting analysis, reads when decoded, "Subject, Franklin Pierce, Attorney Baltimore. Initial assessment, $3,000 $4,000 liquid assets, possible additional securities. Processing completed without complications. Yield, $3,847 cash, $1,200 gold. Legal documents requiring investigation. Disposal via standard route. C. Recommends deeper burial due to seasonal water table concerns. Note, subject mentioned Baltimore associates expecting correspondence. Will require forgery within 2 weeks." Another entry attributed to Celeste reveals her methodical approach. V. Concerns herself with the social aspects while I manage the technical requirements. Her conversations with subjects before processing provide valuable intelligence for subsequent documentation. However, her tendency to prolong these interactions increases risk of discovery. Recommend limiting engagement to essential information gathering only. The ledger revealed that the sisters had murdered at least 19 individuals over their 20 months of operation, acquiring what would be equivalent to nearly $3 million in today's currency through cash, gold, property deeds, and negotiable securities. The scope and systematic nature of their crimes dwarfed anything previously documented in territorial criminal history. The most comprehensive record belonged to their final victim, Thomas Blackford, a railroad investor from San Francisco, who had arrived at the mountain retreat just 3 days before the avalanche. His entry, apparently written by Victoria on the very day of the disaster, provides a chilling glimpse into their final operation. Subject arrived December 15th, carrying substantial railroad bonds and authorization for $25,000 investment. Represents highest yield potential to date. Subject appears suspicious of our operations. Mentioned previous negative experiences with frontier accommodations. C. Recommends immediate processing to prevent potential complications. Weather conditions favorable for disposal. Processing scheduled for tonight, pending confirmation of room isolation. The timing suggests that Blackford might have been saved only by the avalanche's intervention. His body was found in the wreckage of his room, killed by the building's collapse rather than by the sisters' design. An ironic twist that investigators would later note represented the only time natural forces had protected one of their intended victims. The discovery created an immediate sensation throughout the territory and beyond. The Denver Post ran a front-page story on December 22, 1874, with the headline, "Chamber of Horrors Exposed in Mountain Retreat. Female Proprietor Suspected in Systematic Murder of Guests." The article described the Blackwood sisters as women of apparent refinement who concealed appetites for murder that defy comprehension, and suggested they had transformed hospitality into an instrument of death. The story was quickly picked up by newspapers across the nation. The New York Times published a detailed account on December 28th, focusing on the systematic nature of the crimes and the sophisticated methods employed. The article noted that the calculated efficiency of these murders, combined with the perpetrators' success in maintaining their facade of respectability, raises disturbing questions about the nature of civilization on our western frontier. The territorial governor, facing mounting criticism from both local residents and national press, authorized an intensive investigation. A special commission was established with broad authority to examine every aspect of the case, including potential official complicity in allowing the crimes to continue. The investigation revealed the full extent of the sisters' manipulation of local authorities and community leaders. Marshal Peterson was arrested on charges of accepting bribes and neglecting his duties. Several other officials were forced to resign when their financial connections to the Blackwood sisters became public knowledge. Deputy Marshal Cartwright, whose unofficial investigation had been vindicated, was promoted to acting marshal and put in charge of the manhunt for the fugitive sisters. His first action was to issue detailed wanted notices to law enforcement agencies throughout the Western Territories and Mexico. The wanted poster, distributed widely throughout the region, described Victoria Blackwood as approximately 29 years of age, 5 feet 6 inches in height, dark brown hair, distinctive scar on left hand from childhood accident, well-educated speech patterns, likely traveling with substantial funds in gold and currency. Celeste was described as approximately 26 years of age, 5 feet 4 inches, blonde hair, notably quiet demeanor, possible training in medical or chemical procedures based on evidence of drug use in crimes. Despite an extensive search, the Blackwood sisters were never apprehended. The avalanche had provided them with perfect cover for their escape. In the chaos of the rescue efforts and the shocking discovery of their crimes, no one had thought to look for the perpetrators themselves. Territorial communications with authorities in surrounding regions proved fruitless, though unconfirmed reports suggested the women may have made their way south toward New Mexico, or possibly across the border into Mexico. A stagecoach driver in Colorado Springs reported seeing 2 women matching their descriptions, purchasing passage to Santa Fe on December 20th, but the trail went cold there. A telegraph operator in Santa Fe mentioned 2 women of similar description who had inquired about travel arrangements to El Paso, but again, no definitive confirmation could be obtained. Some historians have suggested that the sisters may have prepared for just such an emergency escape, possibly including false identity papers and cached funds at strategic locations along potential escape routes. The investigation that followed the discovery revealed the true scope of their criminal enterprise. Based on the recovered documentation and physical evidence, territorial authorities compiled a list of confirmed victims that read like a catalog of the territory's visiting business elite. The victims included Robert Morrison, Chicago manufacturing equipment supplier, February 1874; Franklin Pierce, Baltimore attorney, July 1874; Marcus Thornton, Philadelphia industrialist, March 1874; Benjamin Wheeler, Boston investment banker, March 1874; Charles Hamilton, New York mining investor, April 1874; David Richardson, St. Louis Railroad developer, May 1874; William Patterson, Chicago grain merchant, June 1874. George Caldwell, San Francisco shipping magnate, July 1874. Henry Morrison, Baltimore banking heir, August 1874. Samuel Westbrook, Philadelphia mining engineer, September 1874. Thomas Garrett, Boston textile manufacturer, September 1874. Edward Sullivan, Chicago livestock trader, October 1874. James Anderson, New York real estate developer, October 1874. Michael O'Brien, San Francisco hotel owner, November 1874. Joseph Martinez, Santa Fe merchant, November 1874. Daniel Thompson, Denver banking associate, November 1874. Robert Clark, Kansas City railroad investor, December 1874. Andrew Davis, Chicago mining equipment manufacturer, December 1874. Thomas Blackford, San Francisco railroad investor, December 1874. Each case was extensively documented in the sisters' records, revealing not only their systematic approach to murder, but also their sophisticated understanding of financial manipulation and identity theft. They had created false documents transferring property, sent deceptive correspondence to families and business associates, and in several cases had successfully collected on investments or insurance policies belonging to their victims. The financial complexity of their crimes required a separate investigation team, led by Treasury agents from Washington. This investigation revealed that the sisters had established banking relationships in multiple territories under various names, systematically converting stolen property and securities into more portable forms of wealth. One particularly sophisticated scheme involved the gradual liquidation of a mining claim belonging to victim David Richardson. Over a period of 6 months after Richardson's murder, the sisters had used forged documents to sell shares in his claim to investors in different territories, collecting payment while creating a paper trail that would have taken years to unravel under normal circumstances. The psychological aspects of the case attracted attention from alienists, the 19th century equivalent of psychiatrists, who were fascinated by the combination of apparent normalcy and calculated brutality displayed by the sisters. Dr. Harrison Wells, professor of mental science at Harvard Medical School, published an analysis in the American Journal of Insanity in 1876. Dr. Wells wrote, "The Blackwood case presents a disturbing example of what we might term cooperative insanity, wherein two individuals appear to have reinforced each other's criminal tendencies to create a partnership more dangerous than either might have been individually. The elder sister appears to have possessed the manipulative abilities characteristic of the criminal type, while the younger demonstrated the methodical attention to detail that made their operation successful." Wells continued, "What makes this case particularly noteworthy is the complete absence of what alienists would consider typical indicators of criminal insanity. These women maintained social relationships, contributed to community causes, and demonstrated concern for their reputation, all behaviors consistent with rational, albeit morally corrupt individuals. They approached murder not as an expression of mental disease but as a business proposition with clearly defined processes and profit margins. The territorial prison system was unprepared to deal with the aftermath of such extensive crimes. With 19 confirmed murders and complex financial fraud spanning multiple jurisdictions, the legal proceedings consumed territorial resources for years. Families of victims filed claims for recovered property, but much of the stolen wealth had been converted to forms that proved difficult to trace or recover. Mrs. Eleanor Morrison, whose persistence had helped bring initial attention to her husband's disappearance, finally received confirmation of his fate, but little satisfaction. In a letter to her sister, dated January 15, 1875, she wrote, "The authorities have confirmed my worst fears about Robert, but the women responsible have vanished like smoke on the wind. The marshal assures me they are searching, but I suspect they are more concerned with protecting their own reputations than with capturing these monsters." She continued, "What troubles me most is not just the loss of my husband, but the knowledge that these women preyed upon the very trust and hospitality that are supposed to distinguish civilized society from barbarism. How many other establishments across the frontier might harbor similar predators? How many travelers have simply vanished without anyone caring enough to investigate?" The case prompted significant changes in territorial law enforcement procedures and interstate communication protocols. The territorial governor established new requirements for local officials to report missing persons cases to higher authorities, and a system was implemented for sharing information about suspicious disappearances across territorial boundaries. However, these reforms came too late for the victims of the Blackwood sisters, and too late to prevent their escape to whatever new hunting ground they might have chosen for their continued predation. The last credible sighting of the sisters came from Father Miguel Santos, a priest in a small Mexican border town, who reported in 1876 that 2 American women matching their descriptions had visited his church, claiming to be widows seeking to start new lives in Mexico. They had made a substantial donation to the church's building fund and had asked detailed questions about the local population and business opportunities. Father Santos noted in his report to church authorities, the women spoke of their desire to establish a boarding house for travelers passing between Mexico and the United States. They asked specifically about the types of people who typically passed through our region and seemed particularly interested in those who traveled alone with substantial resources. Something in their manner disturbed me, though I could not precisely identify what caused my unease. The women had departed the next morning, claiming urgent business in the south, and were never seen again. Whether they were indeed the Blackwood sisters remains unconfirmed, but the pattern of their inquiries and their sudden departure when questioned more closely about their background suggests a troubling possibility that their predatory activities may have continued. The site where Blackwood's mountain retreat once stood was never rebuilt. The territorial government, eager to distance itself from the scandal, declared the location unsuitable for development due to ongoing avalanche risk. The land was eventually incorporated into what would become the Roosevelt National Forest, ensuring that the location of these horrific crimes would remain undisturbed. Local accounts from the years following the disaster suggest that the site acquired a reputation for supernatural activity, though these reports are likely embellishments added to an already disturbing narrative. James Mitchell, a surveyor who worked in the area in 1881, noted in his journal, "Camped near the old Blackwood site last night. The men refused to sleep there, claiming they heard voices in the wind. Purely superstitious nonsense, of course, though I admit the place has an unsettling atmosphere that defies rational explanation." In 1923, during construction of a new mountain highway, workers discovered additional human remains approximately half a mile downstream from the original site. The Colorado State Historical Society concluded these were likely additional victims whose bodies had been carried by seasonal flooding before the crimes were exposed. The remains were reinterred with those previously discovered, in a common grave marked only with the date of discovery and the simple inscription, "Unknown Victims of the Blackwood Murders, 1873-1874. The case continued to fascinate historians, criminologists, and the public throughout the 20th century. It became the subject of numerous academic studies, true crime books, and at least 3 documentary films. The combination of female perpetrators, frontier setting, and the unprecedented scale of the crimes made it a compelling, if disturbing, chapter in Western American history. Dr. Patricia Harrison, in her definitive 1987 study, Predators of the Frontier, Gender and Violence in Territorial America, noted that the Blackwood case challenged conventional understanding of both frontier crime and female criminal behavior. The mythology of the American West focuses on male outlaws, gunfighters, bank robbers, cattle rustlers, men who operated openly and whose crimes were generally understood within the context of frontier violence. The Blackwood sisters represent something far more sinister: predators who weaponized societal expectations about female behavior to create perfect cover for systematic murder. Harrison continued, "In an era when women were viewed as civilizing influences, the idea of women as calculating predators was almost inconceivable. This cultural blind spot created an ideal environment for their operation. Their gender became their most effective disguise, allowing them to operate with virtual impunity, while their victims' families and law enforcement authorities looked elsewhere for explanations." The psychological profile of the sisters has attracted attention from modern criminologists studying collaborative murder. Dr. Robert Chen, in his 2003 analysis, Partners in Death, The Psychology of Collaborative Killers, suggests the Blackwoods represented a particularly dangerous combination of personality types. Victoria appears to have been the dominant personality, charismatic, manipulative, and capable of inspiring trust, while simultaneously identifying and exploiting human weaknesses. Celeste provided the methodical attention to detail and technical expertise that made their operation sustainable. Such partnerships are extraordinarily dangerous precisely because they combine predatory instinct with systematic efficiency. Chen notes that while most serial killers operate from psychological compulsion, the Blackwood sisters appear to have been motivated primarily by material gain. They approached murder as a business enterprise with clearly defined procedures, careful record-keeping, and strategic planning. They viewed their victims not as human beings, but as sources of revenue to be harvested. This commodification of human life represents a particularly chilling form of psychopathy. The case also raised disturbing questions about community complicity in evil. The residents of Silver Creek had observed the pattern of disappearances, noted the sisters' unusual wealth and mysterious background, yet chose silence over investigation. Economic self-interest, frontier pragmatism, and the sisters' careful cultivation of influential relationships created a conspiracy of willful blindness that cost numerous lives. Dr. Michael Torres, professor of frontier history at the University of Colorado, observed in his 1995 analysis, the Blackwood case represents a failure not merely of law enforcement, but of community conscience. When we prioritize economic benefit over human welfare, when we value our comfort over the lives of strangers, we create the very moral wilderness we claim to be civilizing. The broader implications extend beyond the specific crimes. The Blackwood case highlighted the particular vulnerabilities of frontier society: the isolation, the transient population, the minimal institutional oversight, and the cultural assumptions that could be exploited by sophisticated predators. How many other such operations existed across the American frontier, run by individuals who, unlike the Blackwoods, were never exposed? Professor Elena Rodriguez, in her 2001 study, Hidden Histories of the American West, suggests that the focus on dramatic, masculine forms of frontier violence has obscured more subtle, but equally deadly forms of predation. We remember the gunfights and bank robberies because they were visible, dramatic events that fit our narrative expectations about the Wild West. But the most successful predators were those who worked in the shadows, who understood that the best camouflage was respectability itself. The environmental exposure of the Blackwood crimes was ultimately fortunate. Without the avalanche, their operation might have continued indefinitely. The sophistication of their methods, their understanding of human psychology, and their manipulation of social and official structures suggest they were far from finished with their deadly business. The last confirmed information about the Blackwood sisters comes from an unlikely source: a deathbed confession recorded by a priest in Guadalajara, Mexico, in 1923. Sister Mary Catherine, an elderly American nun who had spent decades working with the poor in Mexico, claimed to have known the true identity of two American women who had operated a boarding house in a remote mountain village in the 1880s. According to the nun's account, recorded by Father Antonio Morales and preserved in church archives, the women had arrived in the village around 1878, claiming to be widows seeking to start new lives. They established a small inn that catered to travelers crossing between Mexico and the southwestern United States. Over several years, numerous guests had simply vanished, their disappearances attributed to bandits or the dangers of mountain travel. Sister Mary Catherine claimed that one of the women, whom she knew as Senora Victoria, had confessed on her deathbed in 1901 to being Victoria Blackwood. According to this account, Victoria had described their Colorado crimes in detail and expressed no remorse, viewing their victims as weak men who deserved their fate for trusting strangers. The confession also suggested that Celeste had died years earlier, possibly murdered by Victoria herself during a dispute over money. However, this account cannot be verified, and some historians question its authenticity, noting that deathbed confessions from remote locations were often embellished or entirely fabricated. What remains indisputable is the impact of the Blackwood case on American criminal justice and frontier governance. The territorial reforms implemented after the scandal included improved communication systems between law enforcement agencies, mandatory reporting of missing persons cases, and enhanced oversight of frontier businesses catering to travelers. These changes came too late for the 19 confirmed victims and their families, but they may have prevented similar operations from achieving the same level of success. The case became a cautionary tale about the importance of institutional oversight and community vigilance in protecting society's most vulnerable members. Today, hikers occasionally pass through the area where Blackwood's mountain retreat once stood. Forest Service signs mark the historical significance of the location, though they provide only minimal details about the crimes that occurred there. The Colorado Historical Society maintains a small marker acknowledging the victims, in memory of those who lost their lives to violence in this place, 1873, 1874. May their stories serve as a reminder of our obligation to protect the innocent and seek justice for the forgotten. The story of the Blackwood Sisters serves as a dark reminder that evil often wears civilized masks, that the most dangerous predators are those who understand how to exploit our fundamental human tendency to trust, and that the price of safety is eternal vigilance against those who would transform hospitality into an instrument of death. In the end, the Blackwood Sisters succeeded not only in claiming numerous lives, but in attacking the very bonds of trust that hold society together. Their legacy is a permanent scar on our understanding of frontier history, and a sobering reminder that true horror resides not in supernatural phenomena, but in the calculated malice of human hearts that have abandoned all moral constraint in pursuit of material gain. Their crimes echo across time as a warning that civilization is far more fragile than we imagine, and that beneath the veneer of respectability, predators can thrive when communities choose convenience over conscience and prosperity over protection of the innocent. So what's your take on all this? Do you believe the Blackwood Sisters represent an isolated aberration in frontier history? Or were they part of a larger pattern of hidden predation that we've simply failed to document? Were their crimes primarily motivated by greed? Or was there something deeper and more disturbing driving their systematic destruction of human life? Drop your theory in the comments below. We read every single one, and your insights often reveal perspectives we hadn't considered. And if you're fascinated by these dark chapters of forgotten history, make sure you subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell. We uncover the buried stories of America's past every single week, revealing the crimes, conspiracies, and mysteries that shaped our nation in ways most people never realize. Finally, if you think others need to know about these hidden histories that challenge everything we thought we knew about the American frontier, share this video with them. Help us bring these forgotten victims' stories to light and ensure their tragic fates serve as warnings for future generations.